Thank you for having me here. You're as unruly as a group of undergrads. So what I want to talk about today is the idea of secrets. And this actually got touched on just a second ago with some of the ideas of what's happening with all the data that's being collected. And I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. I don't have any good, juicy secrets that I'm going to reveal today. What I want to talk about is three big things. Three things that are happening in our world that are coming together at the same time. Then I want to tell you how I'm using those in the information security context. And then I want to talk about some implications of that for the future. So let's start off with, I think that secrets, as the question just came out, may be an unexpected casualty of our emphasis on data and analytics. If you think about three things that are happening, one, we have pervasive, ubiquitous information technology. We've seen lots of examples of that. Tom mentioned some of those at the beginning. Certainly, Marvin mentioned a lot of different ways that data is being collected by Google and certainly by others. We have a phenomenal amount of advances in technologies, tools, and systems to process that data. If we just had the data with no way to process it, we'd be nowhere. And third, we actually have a growing understanding with companies like Google, companies like Apple, companies like Amazon that are showing us lots of cool things that can be done with this data. And the question that I have is, what happens when all these things come together? What happens when we have these three things together? Are the effects positive? Is this great, cool stuff for society, or is it negative? So if I think about some negatives, what about all this data that we're collecting? We mentioned privacy issues here earlier. What about your credit cards that seem to disappear with alarming frequency? These are the kinds of things that some of the negatives of data that can come out. And so what I want to do today is spend a little bit of time talking about my particular interest area, which is information security, and how this inherent tension between good and bad exists, how hard it is to keep a secret in our modern world, and how we can use that to our advantage in my context, and some potential benefits that may come from that. So let's get started. What do you do if you find out a secret? And in my context, I'm thinking about secrets as problems. What if you find something that someone doesn't want you to know, particularly like in my context would be a software vulnerability, but let's think about alarm systems. If your home is protected by an alarm system and someone discovers that that alarm system doesn't work, or has a hole in it, or has a weakness in it, what should that someone do? Well, let's think about the two choices. If that researcher finds a weakness in this alarm system and tells everybody, what's going to happen? Well, every house will get robbed immediately, right? All the bad guys will find that out. So you might be tempted to think, well, let's just keep it a secret. Let's don't tell people. The problem there is that then only the bad guys find out. The alarm company then can't make any corrections. You, as someone whose home is protected by this alarm system, don't know that you actually need to now lock the door, buy an attack turtle. I don't know what you need to do, but you need to do something to back up this system here. And you may be looking at this and trying to figure out what model it is, and trying to figure out, hey, do I have this in my house? Because this actually came out 2 weeks ago as a problem. Maybe you don't. This is a few 100,000 houses have this type of alarm system that are vulnerable to what's called a replay attack. The attackers can listen to the code you put in and then just play it again later when you're not home. But what about something like a hotel lock? There are literally millions of this brand of hotel lock installed at hotels everywhere that have a security weakness that lets people get into that hotel room. This is actually a big problem too, because all these hotel locks are actually disconnected. Even if someone wanted to correct this problem, to actually go door to door to every single hotel lock and update it so that it is no longer vulnerable takes considerable time. Meanwhile, bad guys are going into the hotel rooms. And maybe you don't stay in hotels, but you do use the internet. What happens when people find out weaknesses in the security encryption techniques for signing digital certificates or for transferring encrypted information? What happens when those weaknesses are known? Because even if you don't have a home protected by an alarm or stay in a hotel, we all use the internet. What happens here? What should people do when they find out a problem here? And that's exactly what my research area is about. And so one of the things that I like to think about is information security is not a technical problem. We tend to want to say, hey man, sure, I wish some of those geeks would solve that problem. And maybe I'm looking at Escalante in the back there to see if he's actually working on these problems. What happens when we think about it not as a technology problem, but as an information problem, as an incentive problem, as an economic problem? And that's where my research is. So if I think about it like a race. When something happens, we have a race that starts off between our bad guys who are trying to get in the door and our good guys who are trying to shut the door. And the question every security problem comes down to is who wins this race? And if you think about it, there are lots of things that happen along the path of this race, and what we want to try to do is make it harder for these guys, slow these guys down, and speed these guys up. And so there are a lot of steps in this process. When people find a problem, they try to figure out a way to exploit that problem. They start to pick on companies, and they go along until finally they start to attack companies. Meanwhile, the good guys can also discover the vulnerability. They quickly jump out and try to put countermeasures in place. So countermeasures might be things like antiviruses or intrusion detection systems. Meantime, what they do is they alert the vendor and tell the vendor, hey, you need to correct this problem. You need to fix your alarm system. You need to fix your hotel lock. You need to fix your encryption. And then they start to send these patches out to everybody. And those are the little notices that we get at the bottom of our computer that we never actually click on and install. So it takes a while before companies are actually protected. And so what I think about is what happens when we tell. So as a good guy, if you find a problem, you could tell early, which lets this process of countermeasures start. Or you could wait until more of the patches are available and delay. The problem is you don't have much control over what these people know. And so what I've tried to do in my studies is try to understand what happens when we tell one way versus tell another. So an example of that would be trying to figure out, hey, bad guy, what is it you do when you find out information? The problem is that bad guys are notoriously poor responders to many of our research techniques. So how do we usually attack these sort of problems? Put your professorial hat on. How would you attack this problem? Maybe you would send out a survey, right? So you get a mailing list of bad guys and you send out all the surveys to them and you ask them, so on a scale of 1 to 7, how would you respond to? First, that mailing list doesn't exist. 2, they're not really known for honest responses to survey questions. So this is not going to work. So what else do we do when we want to research things? We get the government to require people to complete information like census forms. I have even less hope for this than I do for my survey approach. My quintessential bad guy is not hanging out waiting for the census guy and say, oh yeah, you're right. My bad, I'm an attacker, sorry. What we do at universities is we like to put students in the labs and we present them with scenarios. We say, all right, pretend you're the CEO, how would you make this decision? This works particularly poorly in the security context because we get a bunch of undergrads and we put them in a lab and say, all right, pretend you're a nefarious bad guy, what would you do in this situation? Really not that good at pretending they're a bad guy. So what do we do here? We have a situation where common research methods fall short. And my argument is that a lot of this data exhaust that we've been talking about today, a lot of this 5 exabytes of data that Marvin mentioned, all that data could be used perhaps for a good purpose in this context. All right, so how do I do that? Well, everybody connects their network to the internet. And because I'm contractually required to do it, all internets are shown as clouds. I don't know why that has happened, but you have to show them as clouds. Nobody's dumb enough to connect their connection directly to the internet. So what we do is we put intrusion detection systems in between them to try to filter out the stuff coming in. Actually, I want y'all to look at this because I spent a while making that jump out in just the right spot. How do people know what's bad? They have a big list of signatures. So this is what bad behavior looks like. Let's stop it. How do you know what's bad behavior? Well, security companies go out there and are constantly monitoring these databases of alerts that are generated to try to figure out bad stuff. They update those signatures, and so there's a constant process, either a machine learning process or human augmented machine learning process to figure out what's bad. What's cool about that from my research is that they keep track of all those databases of alerts. And so then I can start to analyze what do attackers do. So what I've done is I've combined that with information from the National Vulnerability Database, which is a government clearinghouse of security information, along with, I'll go ahead and mention it here, Google information, that Google Trends information that we're just being discussed. Bad guys use Google too, so we can try to figure out what they're thinking when they're using Google as well. So we have about, 500 million alerts from about 1,000 firms. We've got all the information from the National Vulnerability Database, and we look at search behavior for about another 500,000 or so query terms to try to understand what affects attacker behavior. Because remember, we can't ask them directly. What happens? Well, fast forward months and months and years of research, and I have these cool curves where I try to model the diffusion of a technology. We take concepts from marketing, like when do people adopt new products, and I think about bad guys as adopters of new products. When do they adopt cool new vulnerabilities? And so I model those, and I look at how people tell. Do they tell immediately, everybody, or do they tell just a few people and try to keep it quiet? And what I try to quantify is, using this statistical techniques on this equation, is the acceleration that comes from telling everybody immediately, and how many more people get attacked when that happens. And if you're curious, there's a bunch of many more details in a research paper that's published recently. That looks like it may be bad for the good guys to tell early, but I want to caution you to say that there's a lot more going on than that, and if you're curious to read the paper, these sort of effects are much stronger. Bad guys actually jump on times when good guys are busy. When people tell things immediately, the window of opportunity closes quickly, so the time that the attackers can take advantage reduces. And I think the lesson here is not that we shouldn't tell when something bad happens. That's never going to work. It's that we have to react quickly when something does come up. Many more details about that in the paper. But I wanted to think just a minute about what this might imply beyond that. So I've used this in the information security context. There are lots of other contexts where people find out things that they don't want other people to know. If you found out a way to beat the TSA scanners, should you tell? This is a big question. If you tell, there's actually a gun right there. If you tell, then bad guys know how to beat the scanners. If you don't tell, the good guys can't work around this flaw. What if you figure out a way to make a bioterrorist agent from an avian flu virus? Should you tell people? If you do, the bad guys figure out how to make bioweapons. If you don't, the CDC and others don't know how to stop those weapons. If you figure out cool new ways to ride your bike faster, should you tell people or not? Should you try to get advantage, or should you tell people so we get better tests for those particular agents? And I think it's particularly fascinating. Just this week they came out, I don't know why biking is such a big deal, but little bitty tiny electric motors that are in bikes now. I think we should look at them as the avant-garde of how to diffuse information. I think there are lots of ways that we can use data exhaust, and that's my message to you today. I've shown you an example of how I use it in information security. I use it around open source software and how do attackers respond to that. I look at how electronic medical records may lead to increased medical malpractice liability because we're now recording everything that's done in hospitals. I look at how people collaborate on Wikipedia because there's a great deal of data exhaust that comes from that. And most important, how do we make our managers, and I'm in the business school, better consumers of all the data that's out there and coming? I think these are cool topics. There's so many opportunities for data in our world. We can think of both good ways and bad ways, and our challenge is to try to promote the good ways of using data and make it harder to use it poorly. Thank you all.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here to talk about our research at the Timms and Pearls International Study Center. And I want to thank my good colleague, Dr. Michael Martin, for his help with this presentation. He's the other executive director of the Tims and Pearls International Study Center. You might be surprised to know that there is an enterprise in the Lynch School of Education that has touched the lives of 500 million students around the world. We've been here for more than 2 decades, conducting a series of ambitious international assessments in 60 to 70 countries, and the countries use that data to change their educational policies and practices, and as those ripple through education systems over time, we estimate that we've touched the lives of at least 500 million students. For more than 20 years, we have been conducting our assessments in mathematics and science at the 4th grade and the 8th grade, as well as our TIMSS Advanced Assessment for 12th grade students. In 2001, we developed our Pearls assessment in 4th grade reading to be a complement to our TIMSS mathematics and science assessments. And most recently, we started ePearls, our assessment of online reading. TIMSS and Pearls are rooted in big data. The essential idea is that countries have different ways of educating their students, and by looking at those similarities and differences across countries, you can learn about the best ways to assess students. And this idea was actually more than 50 years old, and it was had by the founders of our parent organization, IEA. And I decided that it passed the Google toothbrush test in that education is good for people. And the founders of International Assessments decided that it was really becoming impossible to use small samples, so they decided to use the world as an educational laboratory. So they took advantage of everything that was there. Of course, the idea of international assessments wasn't really made very feasible until more recently with the advent of technology. So in today's world, with our capabilities, we here at Boston College can develop these assessments, and all of the questionnaires, you should realize that together with our assessment data, we have extensive questionnaire data from students, their parents, their teachers, their principals, their countries, about their context for learning mathematics, science, and reading. And all of this data is here, and we're using it today. When TIMSS started in 1995, it was the largest and most ambitious international assessment. It had 5 grade levels in 40 countries. And there were some surprises in some countries when the first data were released. The United States, for one, assumed it would be near the top. After all, at that time, we were going to be #1 in the world in mathematics and science by the year 2000. But as you can see, that didn't really quite happen. We were down the list and in some denial. At the time, we were in a huge frenzy of reform, as often it seems like we are, working on educational reform. But so the pundit just said, oh, it was that the reforms hadn't taken hold and surely we'd be first next time. But, oh well. 5 assessments later, and this still hasn't really come to pass. And not only that, a large gap has developed between the top performing countries and the United States. In 2011, the most recent data that we've reported, you can see that the Asian countries, and in particular Korea, Singapore, and Chinese Taipei, led the world by a substantial margin with scores of 600. Here is the United States, which, as we might say, is climbed to the top of the countries being left behind, is still at 500, which is 100 points behind the leading countries, which is equivalent to about 2 years of education. That's a serious gap. Now, the United States is improving, and we're happy for that. And when we release our TIMSS results for 2015 this November, we hope that this trend will continue. On the other hand, there's the trend for Korea. So you can see that the Asian countries are improving at a much faster rate than the United States, so it's also possible that that gap will be even larger. So everything is relative. Here is Sweden, a very modern society, and they have been seeing their educational achievement decline since 1995. Now they've just increased funding for mathematics and science education substantially and strengthened the school inspectorate, so they're hoping to get back on the upward track. Our goal at the Timms and Pearls International Study Center is to help all countries remain on an upward trajectory. We spend an enormous amount of energy researching about what works within and across countries. For example, home support for learning is very important. Students whose homes have resources such as parents with good educations and occupations, lots of books and instructional materials in the home, technology, study supports, they have much higher achievement than students who do not. Also very important, students whose parents engage them in early literacy and numeracy activities from the very beginning. And then those students also go to pre-primary education so that they start school already with an arsenal of reading and math skills. Those students have an enduring advantage. Higher achieving students also attend schools that emphasize academic success, more rigorous curriculum, more effective teachers, parents who care, and the schools are safe and orderly. There is evidence that bullying is on the rise, especially with the emergence of cyberbullying. And finally, such schools have adequate resources for instruction. We at the Lynch School of Education, of course, appreciate the impact of effective classroom instruction, especially students learn complex reading skills in the early grades and are engaged in their classroom lessons. Timms and Pearls provide a catalyst for worldwide educational improvement. A country can participate, see their relative standing in a global context, institute some reforms in practices and policies, and then in the next assessment, be able to evaluate the success of those improvements. We have an immense amount of data. We have millions of records, and each one has the achievement data, not to mention hundreds of explanatory variables. They're all in an international database that is very securely housed at Boston College, we believe, and still, able to be accessed by researchers around the globe. We have qualitative data as well in the form of our Timms and Pearls encyclopedias that are co-authored with our countries. Each country writes a chapter describing their educational system as well as their curricula in math and science and reading. So here at Boston College, in our home at the Lynch School of Education, we have grown into a $100 million enterprise. We built on our Timms and Pearls flagships to develop more appropriate assessments for a broad range of students. For example, our Timms Advanced is for top track students in math and physics. Timms Numeracy and Literacy are for children in developing countries who are still developing fundamental skills in those areas. And then most interesting for today are our eTIMS and ePearls assessments born of the digital age. TIMS on a tablet or eTIMS as we call it, offers everything that TIMS did, but better and more. Because it's interactive, we can ask students to do things and assess their skills. Because it's engaging, students are more motivated to participate. In this particular task about perimeter and area, students are helping Lily design her garden. And this student is drawing a garden that has a perimeter of 12 meters and has 6 sides and only right angles. And after doing that, then the student can examine the area of the garden by populating it with flower boxes. So what our e-assessments can do is track students' progress through their taps and click, which provides an enormous amount of research data for people to study successful paths to problem solving or pinpoint where students get stuck. In this experiment about which fertilizer will help the pepper plants grow best, students actually have 3 trays of seedlings there. And so they first choose their fertilizer. They then next choose how much water to put in each of the trays of seedlings. And then 6 months go by, and they're shown the results of their choices. So this student had some thriving plants, but also, as you can see, made a sort of a mistake. Our ePearls is our innovative new reading assessment for an online world. Students, guided by a teacher avatar, work on social studies and science tasks in an internet environment where it's full of taps and clicks and links and animated things. And again, we can track their navigation as they go through these sites. This, interestingly enough, was sent to us by our colleague in Portugal. ePearls is happening as we speak, so listen and you can hear the clicks. And so he was very proud that they were kicking it off there, and we got some enjoyment out of this too. So in this ePearls task, students are reading about different parts of the Mars rover and what each one of them does. And then when they finish their reading, you can see that the teacher avatar has posed them some questions which they can answer with a drop-down menu. In this task about the rainforest, they read about the spider monkey, the sloth, and the poison arrow frog. And same thing here, except they type in their answers. Finally, the ePearl students go on a migration around the Serengeti, following the wildebeests and zebras. So here you can see the wildebeests and zebras are following the grass. And the students are also reading about how they're being chased by predators at the same time. And then, once again, they type in their answers to various questions. So we at the Tims and Pearls International Studies Center, together with our cadre of graduate students from the Lynch School's measurement program, are very busily bringing Tims and Pearls into the digital age. I don't know that we'll ever have Google-sized data, but we're going to have a lot. At the same time that we are working on finishing our analysis of our TIMS 2015 results for 4th, 8th, and 12th grade, so that this November we'll have a celebration of 20 years of TIMS trends. So in conclusion, we have amassed a lot of data, which we expect to increase exponentially through the coming years, and we also look forward to preparing all the educational researchers who can deal with our data avalanche. So, thank you.
Good morning. I'm Joe Nugent. I teach literature. I'm not sure what I'm doing here. That's not entirely true. I teach it sometimes to undergraduates who came to BC to pursue science of one sort or another, not to find themselves a little disgruntled, perhaps, in literature classes. And when I mention my research, I know the skeptical glaze that will appear in their eyes. Research, they know, is stuff that's done in laboratories with graphs and computers and test tubes, that sort of thing. I, they know, merely read. I sit, they understand, in dusty corridors, cobwebbed perhaps, perusing crumpled texts with a pencil behind my ear. That's not the case, I insist. We're in the same pursuit. I collect data. I propose and test hypotheses. I draw conclusions, I write them up, I present them to my peers, and I publish them. I send them out into the world as ideas. Universities, I explain to them, are factories for the manufacture of ideas. That's what we do. And furthermore, I say that when we generate these ideas in laboratories and institutes and classrooms, the raw material of these ideas, I tell them, is words. And words is what we do in literature departments. The best research advice I got was from my dissertation advisor, a man called John Bishop, a great Joycean scholar. The trick, John said, is knowing what not to read. That was easy enough advice for Professor Bishop to give in 1950 or 70 when he was an undergraduate, when he was confronted with perhaps about 250 books and articles on James Joyce that would come out in that year. My students today have to deal with perhaps 50,000 or so texts. This is very bright here, is it? Can you see that? 50,000 or so texts and articles on Joyce published now. Formidable and not doable. So we have a problem, a big data issue. And that's produced something akin to a crisis in literature departments, a crisis about authority. Let me explain. Not many people in English literature were revered as highly as a man called Ian Watt. Watt in 1957 published the most authoritative work of literature at the time called The Rise of the Novel. It examined with the utmost detail and dedication the three outstanding novelists of the 18th century, Defoe, Richardson, and Fielding. Watt's close reading of these great works and his wonderful extrapolation explained magisterially how and why the English novel became the huge force that it did, and that it remains. But what nobody asked then was, of course, about the 3 or the 4 or the 5,000 other novels published in England between 1700 and 1800 that Watt didn't read. The question was unthinkable at the time. And anyway, these were minor novelists, some of them women, others even foreigners, actually. And towered over, of course, by these great giants, Defoe, Fielding, and Richardson. And what's more, there were quite simply too many of these novels. But that question is no longer unthinkable. Nowadays, these can be read by machines because of the digitization of huge numbers of those texts and the development of ways to exploit them. So here's the issue that big data has thrown into relief. We now have to accept that one person's dedication, one person's brain is no longer sufficient, that one person's life is no longer long enough for the assertion of authority that our discipline depends upon. Authority is perhaps the most precious of commodities in universities. Universities, to a degree, run on it. I think we spend our lives in universities building up that authority that allows us the right to stand in front of audiences and classrooms and to state with the expectation that we'll be believed. Is that authority now to be questioned by digital whippersnappers with graphs? That's perhaps the question. What do literature professors know about big data? Well, quite a lot, I think. Much of my research is on what is the funniest book that you'll probably never read. It is, of course, Finnegan's Wake. And if any book ever could be called Concentrated Big Data, I think it's James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. Joyce knew a lot of things about words, about research, and about big data. Words that were verbigraciating from murmurentus till stridocilarius. Among data so big that it can be called, and our research, our minds working, the wringlings and wronglings in our minds as we try to work with data that is sometimes so great that it can only be called Incomputables, a term that I've just been told, in fact, is now one that's used in computer sciences and in mathematics. It was a term that Joyce had long before Alan Turing actually could have come up with such a thing. It's a small example of the prescience and the brilliance of a man called Joyce. We're all familiar with the word quark, of course, that he invented, but so many more. Incomputables. And often, actually, our minds going through mental mazes that may be, in fact, dealing with an uncomeoutable. And it's all in search of meaning, of that most elusive and undefinable term, meaning, the may mean meaning of my moon mining, he calls it. Finnegan's Wake is an exercise in teasing meaning out of complexity. Joyce knew that studying words is making meaning. It's producing ideas. We are mining for meaning in Finnegan's Wake. But Joyce could only imagine access to that great data bank, the 150 million books published since the invention of the printing press, or, of course, the 5 million textbooks now digitized by Google. So what are we in English departments doing about this? I'm going to show you briefly 3 of the many tools developed to help us explore meaning in that great, enormous data bank. The first one is, well, data mining. And the simplest one, something that you may already have played around with, is the Ngram Viewer developed by Google. It's a lot of fun. It is, of course, a data history of words in enormous data banks that Google has produced for us. Here, I just happened to put in the word data, and it's not terribly surprising that it first emerges, you might say, in the 20th century, as with the rise of global trade, with the rise of typewriters and computing machines, of calculators and that. Of course, that's not surprising. And it's not surprising either that if I were to put in, as I did, the term big data, that it more or less didn't exist before around about 1995. No great surprises there, but there are surprises and disappointments for people like me when they put in, for example, James Joyce and W.B. Yeats. And Yeats, I'm delighted, fellow Irishman, to see him actually up there, but rather sad to see Joyce languishing so lowly. However, Joyce is not the least of men. Others, at least up until 2000, languished even more lowly. Words. But we can move beyond words to whole themes and delve into these data banks for information there. And this is what I'm going to call topic modeling. Here's a smaller but rather wonderful data bank. It's the digitized volumes of a journal called Signs. Yes, good. Signs is perhaps the predominant feminist scholarship, and over 4 decades they drew some maps of what was going on. I'll go back over to that one here, that colourful but almost preposterous guide. The one thing here that within that I notice here is that the thing called women's roles gets smaller and smaller over the course of that 40 years. Well, maybe I can look some other place to discover something more about it, and there's women's roles down here. Or if I maybe turn those around so that we get the kind of spatial description of them, we see that women's roles are clustered here alongside a number of other topics that they seem to interact with, that they're not outliers like here. Or perhaps if we go down deep into them, I can find actually that topic itself, women's roles, here we are, and I can read actually over time and the number of articles and the words that it relates to, and that's the kind of information that I'm suggesting that can be delved out of here. So the hypothesis here might be, for what it's worth, that the smallness of women's roles, the diminishing account in women's roles might be, in fact, that their role in the world has become consolidated over the 40 years, that it's no longer as disputed as much as it is. Now, that's to say that these, of course, can only be tools in helping us to understand what it's about. We are still in the business of actually working with that information and making it work for us. I'm going to move on to the third example that we use. Good. Network analysis. Network analysis. Connecting characters. Look at this here. This is a small one indeed, of just Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus. Leopold Bloom, heroes of James Joyce's Ulysses, who interact in 1,000 different ways with 300 or more characters over the course of the day that's described in James Joyce's Ulysses. This here is just the beginning of a map to model their behaviors. It's only a glimpse here and it's in 2 dimensions, but we can imagine that in 3 dimensions, and we can imagine that if we can actually, and we can, of course, with a bit more the tools than I have here on my computer, that we can, of course, map one of the list of characters upon the other and see how the individuals interact over the course of the day. Or we can go a little bit further, actually, and map not just the characters, but perhaps topics. Maybe it might be the themes of their conversations. And again, see how the various relationships enact there. And we're looking at it there simply in 2 dimensions, but we can produce it in 3 dimensions. And it's not surprising that in this extremely complex novel, that the work that we get is a very difficult graph to read. But indeed, with work and in 3 dimensions, we can see a lot about it there. And it's not terribly surprising to us that it is something awfully beautiful. I want to suggest that this has produced something this has done something very important in digital classroom. That the advent of these tools has transformed the energy in the classroom. Throughout history, perhaps, our classrooms have been places, scenes in which there's been a vertical transfer of information, of cultural norms, from authoritative teacher to willing or unwilling student down there. And yes, with occasional returns from them upwards, back upwards to where we are. But digital humanities in the classroom, and these tools have brought about what I'm going to say, the arrival of a horizontal energy of knowledge production. Students, no longer mere absorbers of information, become makers, producers, and distributors of knowledge to be shared, not just with me, and not just with the class, not just with the college indeed, but with the country and even with the world. And so I want very briefly to share with you some of the projects that my own students in English departments have done over the last short while. And the first one is one called Digital Dubliners, and I hope that it's going to come up here. Is it going to come up here? Perhaps. Is iBooks author open here? iBooks it is. Yes, okay, here we are actually. And very briefly, this, I'm saying, was produced entirely by my students. It's a digital textbook. It's so much enhanced over what one gets in an ordinary textbook, it's hard to describe. We took here some of the foremost Joycean scholars in America, and they very happily gave their no need to hear them there, but gave their expertise. It comes with things like interactive maps so that the students can actually trace the movements of the characters across the book. It comes with yes. Oh my goodness. Oh really? Well, that's not much use. I'm so very sorry. Well then, okay, you're just going to have to hear what it does. In fact, you don't have to hear it at all. The happy thing is that I'm very sorry. You don't have to listen to me. Simply listen to me at all. Actually, you can. Digital Dubliners anyway is a free digital textbook. I'll describe what goes on within it, and you can download it yourself. If you have an Apple or you have an iPad, then you will find it there. 15 students in a class took the 15 stories of James Joyce's Dubliners. Each one was responsible for it, and they were responsible for the footnoting and for the glossing of that, for the images, the contemporary images, for the film, for the video that's inserted into it, for the essays that are attached to it. It's been downloaded 7,500 times from the internet, and I can promise you that it quite transforms your reading of Dubliner's textbook. That was one of the first things we did. Another one that we did actually was Joyceways. Joyceways, again produced in my class, was an iPhone app, and that brought you through the text of James Joyce's Ulysses and brought you on tours of Dublin. It won a number of awards, and again, it was something that my students actually produced themselves. These are the kind of things I'm suggesting that this change in energy of the digital classroom has brought about. Joyce himself said that if Dublin were destroyed tomorrow, he said that through his book, we could produce the city itself. The book was so complete that Dublin could be reconstructed, he said, out of my book. It was a nonsense and a preposterous proposal to make. However, maybe we can go some sort of way towards it. Certainly the students in my class this coming fall will do something like this. They will find themselves using contemporary maps of Dublin, tracking along the routes of the individual characters of this book or of Dubliners. along so, and turn left along about here. And going a little bit further, actually, when they get to the end of it, then I hope that through digital representations that they can virtually visit the house of Leopold Bloom that he moves about late in the evening of June the 16th, 1904. And perhaps we can go a little bit further than that with the kind of animations and with the 3D work, and maybe we can, in fact, if we get this one right, we can, in fact, actually imagine animations and reproductions using contemporary photographs and contemporary architectural drawings, actual reconstructions of the city that Joyce was in 1904 that he describes to us there. And that's before we even move to the kind of work that Project Tango is doing, of course, with three-dimensional work. And that's this kind of stuff that I'm going to do in my class. We're working with Oculus, we're working with three-dimensional representations, and we're hoping to actually be able to reproduce in time an immersive experience of James Joyce's Ulysses. That's the kind of promise that's going to go ahead. I'm sorry, I wouldn't need to come to that yet. This is a kind of a terrifying undertaking. I'll take a class of 15 of the brightest students in Boston College, and I'll draw them from as many different disciplines as I can, very particularly, I hope, from computer science, from film, from theatre, as well as from literature, and we will bring about something, I hope, fairly extraordinary. So, where does that bring us finally? Well, I think to the next skeptical student in my literature core class, what I can now point to, I think, is a rejection of the always false dichotomy between the humanities and the sciences. Digital humanities, I'll be able to say, acting upon the threat and upon the promise that came with big data, has produced a realization that they complement each other, that they are mirrors, that they are twins, that they are intertwined, that they're mingled, because, as Joyce said, everything, he said, is deeply intertwined. Thanks very much.
To the table, and we want to open up the room for questions. Have a bit of a panel discussion, and then we will break for lunch. We'll open the doors up on the left and right, and everyone in the room can take the opportunity to talk to our undergraduates and our graduate students on their various projects, and get into the interactive displays that we've put for you. Do we want to do this for the microphone? Okay. Alrighty. Questions?
My name.
Yeah, lunch will be served when the questions have ended. James.
Very enjoyable, all your presentations. I think give us a bigger, broader aspect on the world and how to think about things. My question has to do around what types of skills do you think students across these disciplines would have to have in common to engage with, to engage around the ways in which that you all are working here, and the ways in which that the commonality, what types of common skills do students across these disciplines would have to participate in this type of work?
Joe, how about you
Well,
first?
I guess, if the question is what kind of skills do they have to bring into my classroom? In the construction of Digital Dubliners, I took 15 students, I said. Well, actually, I'm sorry, there were 22 in the end. And I took them quite deliberately from freshmen through sophomores, juniors, seniors. I had a master's students and a couple of PhD students. So I started with a preposterous mix of students and a ridiculous collection of skills and unskills. Really, these things are about pedagogy. The product at the end is the bonus, and of course it's the motivation. It's what gets them to do the kind of thing. It's what's transformed the energy, is the fact that these are, in digital humanities, these are project-based exercises, that they know at the end they're going to have something that they're going to come out with. They're going to have something to put in the portfolio, something with their name on it, maybe even with their photograph on or with their film of themselves on. So I guess my answer is that I'm in the business of teaching them skills. I don't expect them to come with skills. Happily, Boston College is a place in which I can turn to places like the Center for Teaching Excellence and get those skills and import those into the classroom and get the kind of people to come in and to show them those skills. So really, I can take them as novices, I hope, and teach them to the kind of things that enable this kind of work. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the only way I can say it. Yeah.
If this is the world as it is becoming, how do we need to be engaging students to be helping them to be successful in participating in this sort of?
Maybe this is, yeah. So we actually think about this a lot because, and I was thinking about this during SAM and also thinking about James Joyce. I think we need to be better at helping our students have a larger perspective. And I was really struck by the one, the Goebel, the driverless car was driven by wanting to make the world a better place. There was a problem, fewer people dying, less money for fuel. I mean, win, win, win. That motivation to make the world a better place. We often laugh. Our students seem actually to be very good at many technical things. And we talk about the hammer a lot. They get the hammer, and they're proud they've, captured and are excellent at the hammer. And now if only they could find a nail, they'd be all set. And I think that happens to lots of us, How can I use this, maybe even your technique of quantifying security, how can I use this technique to do a dissertation? So, we want ones that will look for the problem that needs to be solved, and then hopefully we've given them the arsenal of hammers and graph making or whatever it is that they can bring that to bear to that.
A slightly different take is to frame it in terms of two separate skills. One is around production of analytical results, and the second is around consumption. And I think we tend to focus more on the production aspects, and that's the hammer category. We get excited about some new algorithm, or we get excited about some cool graph, and that's around production. The much greater gap, and this is borne out in some survey work that I can share with you, is around consumption. The masses are not going to be developing machine learning algorithms. They're not going to be doing that at Boston College. That is not our strength. The difficulty is in being better consumers and appliers of those analytical results, and I think that's our challenge, is to make them better consumers, savvier.
Ginger.
Sam, could you expand a little bit on that? That was also one of the bullets you left us with on your last slide. How do we educate people to be better consumers and managers in this world of increasing data and information? Can you leave us with some ideas around how you're approaching education in that way?
Yeah, so I pontificate on this a great deal, and I'm conscious of students in my class sitting in the room who are probably tired of my pontifications on some of these topics. But there's a certain baseline level of skills that are necessary, and you cannot be data unaware, you cannot be statistics unaware, you cannot be technology unaware, but that's necessary, not sufficient, and that's not going to be differentiating. We're emerging into a world where people like Google make these tools readily available to anybody who can get on a web browser. Is that going to be differentiating? Not anymore. Not if everyone can go to Google. And so what we have to think about is making them better critical thinkers around that. One of the things that we do in a classroom is I give students the same data set and split them into groups and say, you argue for position X and you argue against position X from the same data. So it's debating in a modern data world. And I think those are the skills that we need to work more on rather than in addition to those necessary skills, not instead of.
Yep. Oh, thank you. Any other questions? Everyone's, yeah. Sergio.
One of the questions to comment. I enjoy Sam's talk, but I completely disagree about not being able to develop machine learning algorithms at Boston College. There's a lot of interesting machine learning work going on right at our own campus, and you're not going to hang out around
Yeah. Actually, sorry, I did not lead into, well, I mean, Sergio is going to talk about machine learning algorithms later on. I was specifically thinking about the managerial use of that, not into the, he's going to do a great presentation about machine learning exactly at BC.
And then we'll have a 12-round knockout bout afterwards between Sam and Sergio. I'm kidding.
The one thing I
Great.
might cap off all this is it's easy to get excited about the positives of technologies. I think we have a real responsibility to try to get a handle on many of the negatives. And I didn't want to be too dark in my discussion, but I think that there is much darkness out there that we at BC can be some of the light of the world on that.
Yeah. I mean, and one thing that has struck me about not just Marvin's talk, but the three talks we heard this morning is, one of the many purposes of days like today is for all of us as educators at BC, as faculty, as staff, and is to pause and ask ourselves: do we know where we're going with big data, and are we preparing our students for that? I think that's really one question that I think we need to ask today, and see if we can answer that, and then use that information to hopefully inform not only what we do in our own departments and our majors, but also the upper administration. Because I do wonder about your point, to what extent are our students prepared to walk into a class like Joe's? I mean, I don't think I could do what your students do, Joe. I mean, that was simply amazing.
I can't do what my students
Yeah,
do.
I mean, but and machine learning. We've heard the term machine learning, data analytics more and more today, and I hope what we glean from today in part is, are we doing enough? Are we preparing our students not only to handle the courses and graduate school, but also to meet the demands of the workforce? Yeah. So, any other questions? Yes.
So, and other comments, since I'm sitting next to Sergio, I actually want to push back. Maybe you can't try to take this as a question. On the idea that we're not going into a world in which a large percentage of people will be doing their own machine learning. I wasn't there, but I imagine if you went back 30 years ago, there was probably a group of people around here saying there'll never be a day in which students are doing linear regressions, because that was, of course, something that you couldn't do. It was very hard. You had specialists who did linear regressions. Now it's considered, kind of like child's play statistics. Should we be thinking about training, maybe not everybody, but a large portion of our students to do essentially what is just more sophisticated statistics?
You won't get an argument from me.
Yeah, I think some of the distinction might be, let's pick on the linear regression aspect. It's about using that tool, though. I totally agree if we're talking about using the tool and being savvier user of the tool, getting better at getting data cleaned to go into the regression. Many of the things that go into the whole the environment of the ecology around linear regression. But I don't know that was that there's many people here who are going to be developing the best linear unbiased estimator, right? So I think that's the distinction that I would draw in terms of the developer of the algorithm versus the user of the algorithm. Certainly, I may have overslighted the developer of the algorithm part, and I will back off from that. But I want to argue that there's a bigger problem around the consumption of the algorithm that is the below the iceberg. If we think about it as diffusion of technologies, we've got early adopters who are going to know everything about that technology, but we have the early and late majority and laggards who are not going to get that detail level learning, but are still going to be required to use those results. So I think that's maybe a distinction.
Just one quick comment about the developer of the algorithm. I think the development of these machine learning algorithms is not something that undergraduates were likely going to do anyway, because as we said, like more advanced statistics. I think if we're really talking about development of the algorithm, we would be talking more about PhD students or the like, or assistant professors, postdocs, and so on. But I think educating larger parts of the students in really thoroughly understanding the algorithms and everything that goes along with it in exactly the same way that we now understand OLS, I think that's a realistic goal and something that we should achieve, So I think if that's an intermediate position, then I offer it here.
Good. I saw him with a microphone. I thought he was going to bust me on the acronym for BLUE or something.
All righty, well, we will break and reconvene at 1:30. In the intervening time, we have our students with their interactive digital displays and their research.